And you can get started.
Great. Well, thank you, Kristen, and welcome to everyone today for Managecore's webinar on why Rise with SAP on Google Cloud. So the speakers today are myself, Frank Paul. I'm the partner and president of Managecore, as well as Nick Militich, who's our CTO. So today we're going to cover a couple of topics. First, give you a little bit about background of who Managecore is, just to kind of set the stage. Then talk a little bit about what Rise actually is, because then it'll make a little more sense as we start talking about then why Google Cloud for running Rise. So this is our quick agenda, just a couple of topics. If you're planning ahead, we expect this to be about 45 minutes or so. So with that, let's just dive right in. So first of all, a little bit about Managecore. We are an SAP services provider, and obviously a big partner of Google Cloud. So Managecore really specializes in not only the management of SAP environments, we are also experts in migrating SAP workloads to the cloud. So that includes not only natively migrating your systems into GCP, but also as part of a Rise implementation. So we do all the typical things you would think as a normal SAP service provider. We do project work, we do managed services, we do migrations. We're a Google reseller. And then we have a couple of products around the management, administration, and automation of SAP in a cloud environment. So just real quickly about kind of who we are. As far as our experience in Google Cloud, I venture to say we're probably one of the longest standing Google Cloud partners when it comes to SAP. We started our partnership way back in 2018, shortly after Google and SAP started their partnership and their relationship. And since then on the page, and I won't go through these one by one, but we've had I'll call it a series of milestones in working with Google Cloud and managing SAP workloads. All the way from moving the first productive HANA system into GCP back in 2018 to moving some very fast projects. Pegasystems, for example, we moved their entire SAP landscape into the cloud in only 9 weeks. Last year, notably, we were Google's Partner of the Year for SAP workloads. So we're very proud of that. But we have a lot of experience in doing so. And we also, as this webinar is specifically about Rise, we actually have 4 customers that are currently utilizing Rise in a cloud environment in the Google Cloud. So some of that experience is going to be the premise for our discussion today. And I think it's important to understand that, Rise is a little bit different animal than a traditional SAP landscape, especially if you had been managing it on premise. So I think the next thing we wanted to kind of cover as we talk about this topic is what exactly is Rise? And many of you may be familiar with that, but I know we talk to customers kind of every week that are kind of, trying to get their arms around what really is Rise, because I think, salespeople come in and might talk about what it is or what it isn't. You may have went on other webinars. So from our standpoint, Rise is a pretty straightforward solution. If you think of it, typically is including the SAP licenses. It's the cloud hosting of the SAP landscape. They provide, I'll call it baseline support services of the infrastructure and SAP, what we traditionally call basis administration, as well as the enhancements like the licensing going to S4 or other future transformations that SAP may come out with. Those would be part of that S4 implementation. But that's all bundled into a singular monthly recurring arrangement, right? So if you think if you're licensing today, where you probably bought SAP licenses, if you're on-prem, for example, you bought them last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you had a huge cash outlay, and then you pay annual maintenance for that software. If you go to Rise, you kind of trade in that whole license agreement that you owned previously, and that turns into now a monthly recurring expense. Now, that also from a financial model means you kind of went from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. So there's a whole nother discussion around that, but CFOs are usually very interested in that. And it can we can talk about that in more detail, but that's what this model is, right? And then at the bottom here, we talk about the difference between what is Rise and PCE. And we think that's notable because sometimes the terminology confuses people. And again, Rise is really, think of that as going to the cloud, going to S4 HANA, and having this bundled solution from SAP. But what we have found is some customers, they want to go to the cloud. They like the idea behind Rise, but they're not ready to make that journey to S4 yet. So what SAP can allow you to do is take your ECC, version of the product. You would still have to go to the HANA database, but you can run ECC on HANA, which we also is also known as Suite on HANA. Put that into SAP's cloud. It's a very similar model, but they do call that PCE, right? So if you hear them talking about PCE, it's similar, but just a different version of the product. Again, most SAP sales reps talk about it purely in the case of Rise. I've heard some people speak, even if you stay on ECC, but go into that cloud environment from SAP, they still call it Rise. But again, just from a terminology standpoint, just to keep things straight. So that's what Rise really is. Rise doesn't necessarily have to be, don't be confused with a new product. For example, if you're already running S4, but you're running that on-premise, or maybe you're in a colo data center, and you want to move that into SAP's Rise platform, there's not necessarily a new software product involved. You would just be taking that same S4 environment, moving it into the cloud version of SAP's Rise environment, right? Preferably on Google Cloud. But you would be converting those licenses from on-prem licenses into consumption-based licenses, or on a monthly licensing model. And that would be Rise. But that doesn't mean you have to change software products. So just to be clear about that. Okay. So that's what Rise is. And I guess from a practicality standpoint and understanding some of the roles and responsibilities, this is just a very simplistic stack of kind of the infrastructure and the roles and responsibilities of what it takes to support a Rise environment. And you can see the building blocks here are pretty straightforward, right? So if we start with the platform itself, in this case would be Google Cloud, right? And that can be the Rise platform. You can also move non-SAP workloads if you want those to be in the cloud as well. But the cloud infrastructure would be Google Cloud at the base level, or the foundation there. Then Rise on top of that, as I mentioned, is the SAP licensing, the HANA licensing for the database, the core infrastructure, OS, and database support, including some of the baseline basis support services. And again, that's what they call Rise, or if you stay on ECC 6, PCE. But that's that layer, and that's traditionally what compromises the Rise solution, okay? Now, on top of that, there are customer-facing responsibilities. So although it is somewhat of a turnkey solution, when you go to Rise, there is a rather lengthy, I'll call it roles and responsibility matrix. And I have another slide that will break that down in a little bit more detail. But there still are some customer-facing responsibilities, right? So if you think of the baseline Rise support model, it's kind of keep the lights on. It provides the OS patching, it provides the database patching, the kernel patches, things like that to keep the system functioning. But there are some responsibilities from an administrative standpoint, like managing batch jobs, managing security, things like that, that the customer is still responsible for, in addition to any non-SAP environments, right? So if you're going to move, maybe you have TaxWare or EDI applications or other third-party applications. If you want to move those to the cloud as well, obviously you would be responsible for those. So just remember, as you move to Rise, the Rise platform supports a certain aspect of the platform, the operating system, the database, and the infrastructure, as well as the licensing. But they very well may be additional servers you want to move, additional applications, and then the support of those and the integration of those, you actually want to make sure you account for too. So again, at a very high level, kind of what that support stack looks like, and some of the different responsibilities and who would be responsible for each aspect of that application. So we take that one step further, and we think about what does it mean to actually think about a Rise platform. I think it's worthy to think about the questions that need to be asked as you contemplate moving to a Rise environment, right? And again, maybe not go through these questions one by one, but think about how much of this current landscape goes to Rise. Because one of the things to remember is if you have older SAP products, maybe some that are out of support, you can't necessarily put those into RISE, right? So one of the first questions is, will my entire SAP environment be able to go to RISE? Will it not? What we also understand is when people do think about migrating to RISE, and let's say you are going to upgrade to S4 as part of that migration, it is a great time to depreciate some things that are no longer needed, right? Or things like GRC. Maybe you had a standalone GRC environment. GRC now can be embedded in S4 as one example, right? So you want to kind of take this inventory and think about what you have today and what is that transformation going to look like as part of a RISE implementation, and what may or may not have to migrate as part of that project, right? And then, as I talked about before, third-party applications, other things that may need to be moving with your SAP environment. There's all sorts of network-related questions. You know, who is going to take care of those customer-facing responsibilities? That matrix can be found. It's downloadable on the web. So if you did a search for like RISE, roles and responsibility matrix, you can easily find that if you did a Google search to understand what those are. And then integration of non-SAP systems or SAP systems that are not in RISE and RISE. How does that integration work? How does it all get migrated? And then what does that project plan look like? How are we going to manage this entire project, right? So again, just questions to think about as you move forward with your RISE discussions with SAP and potentially other SIs. But kind of a quick little due diligence checklist. Now, I talked about the different roles and responsibilities. So what this is kind of just a representation of that roles and responsibilities matrix. I'll tell you offhand, it's roughly 50 pages long. And by default, if you look at the pie chart on the right, the standard services as part of a standard RISE agreement covers about 41% of that document, right? There's another large percentage, kind of if we're going clockwise, the optional services, the additional services, and the CAS applications that you can additionally ask SAP to manage for you as well. But then of that roles and responsibility matrix, about 16% are customer-facing responsibilities that you're going to have to take care of yourself, right? And those are more traditional things that make sense. So again, RISE is a great solution because of what it's offering and what it's providing to its customers. But just be aware of some of the responsibilities and some of the functions that may need to be part of that solution. Now, this is where a company like Managecore can come in and fill in these gaps for you. And we can also additionally help you understand where those gaps are, how your internal support team can take care of managing some of those tasks, which ones specifically are going to be managed by SAP, maybe some of these additional tasks you want to be handled by SAP for various reasons, but helping you go through and understand exactly what these requirements may be. So that's just a breakdown of those roles and responsibilities. Okay. Now with that, I will, I guess, before I hand this over to Nick, one more slide. There are a couple different operating models for S/4HANA. And again, I think we want to clarify this from a RISE perspective, right? Because you can run your S4 environment on-premise, right? Some of you may be doing that. You can also run S4 on the cloud, right? So you can natively just move those S4 licenses into a public cloud, for example, running them on GCP. And then there are two RISE editions, right? There's the RISE Private Cloud Edition and the Public Cloud Edition. And just to clarify, the RISE Private Cloud Edition, think of that as more traditionally the on-prem version, but just hosted in the cloud. Whereas the RISE Public Cloud Edition is truly the SaaS model of S4. Think of that as the multi-tenant version of S4, where multiple clients are in the same database or the same database tenant, right? We traditionally think of the Private Cloud Edition more suitable for larger companies that want to heavily customize their application, whereas the Public Cloud Edition is those that want to use pretty much canned out-of-the-box standard processes, standard procedures, and the standard configuration. So just those four implementation models of what S4 looks like. Okay. So with that, now I will turn it over to Nick, And Nick is going to now talk specifically about why running SAP and RISE on the Google Cloud. So Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Frank. So a little bit about why SAP on Google Cloud. Google Cloud really is a great technology stack and a great hyperscaler to run SAP on. It really was purpose-built for workloads like SAP. I won't go into a ton of detail in every single section here, but I do want to touch on a lot of these because it is what makes Google Cloud unique in the industry and why running SAP on GCP is a great platform. So first and foremost, and I'll touch on this a little bit later in the presentation, but Google owns their own network. It's a completely private network. So once you are in Google Cloud, you are on their network. They have their own cabling. They've run it across the ocean, across the world, and it is completely segregated from the public internet. That makes it very safe, very redundant, and very reliable. Because of that, you can run workloads in the environment without having to necessarily worry about latency depending on which zone or region you're in. Another great feature of the private network, but also going into security a little bit, is that the data, because it is on their own network, data is continuously encrypted in transit and at rest. And that can be done because of that network. Nothing has to exit these data centers or these the actual network connectivity. So because of that, you can completely be encrypted throughout your journey internal to Google Cloud. Another great feature of SAP in GCP is live migration. So you can think of that as a beefed up version of VMware's vMotion. Live migration allows for an automatic failover of your environment within a single zone to another physical server. So let's say Google is doing maintenance on a specific server, or they notice that one server has an issue and they need to either take it down or it looks like it's going to go down. Google can actually initiate a live migration, have it fail over to another server. That means for the end user, specifically around SAP, that your SAP environment does not need to go down for hardware maintenance. Google never has that issue. And if for some reason a server hard crashed, it will start up on another server within that zone. So it is unique to Google Cloud and very helpful when we know SAP has to be up 24/7. Live migration allows for that. In addition to that, the pricing model, and kind of going into the flexible resources. So the pricing model in Google Cloud is very unique. They were some of the first to have it really focus on not necessarily the server models themselves, but just pricing models based on CPU and memory. So that means that if I purchased a pricing model based on a 1 year or 3 year commitment, and I purchased enough, let's say it was 8 CPU and 64 gig of RAM, and that equated to 2 servers today, tomorrow I could turn down one of those servers and allocate it all to the single server. Tomorrow I could divvy that up and allocate it to 4 different servers. And there is no price penalty. There's no difference. You are just paying for the CPU and memory. So it's really unique in that fashion that you can actually be able to flex up and down depending on the resources you need without any penalty. And actually, pretty recently, Google came out with an additional CUD co-term model that we've been excited to see. So what that means is that when you actually put something in a 1 or 3 year CUD, and let's say you did that 12 months ago, you put something in a 3 year CUD, and then today you decided to spin up a server, you can actually co-term that CUD, the new CUD, with the old resources. So that provides you flexibility in not having to manage continuous CUDs. So it will now co-term with the most recent CUD, and you can combo those CUDs. You can also split them up. So it's very, very flexible in that aspect, and allows you to really move and plan your resources much better. The next piece of this is the virtualization. So you're not forced into bare metal servers with Google Cloud. Everything is really a virtualization first type of mentality. So Google is continually innovating and engineering to make sure that what comes out works across the board. There are physical servers just based on limitations in general, but Google is usually first to the table when it comes to virtualizing larger HANA servers. They do have a lot of virtual servers with high memory. Another unique feature that we love using in Google Cloud are the redundant backups. So in the majority of the clouds, backups do end up going to zonal disk. So when you take a backup, whether it's using backend, which Google supports, they can write directly to Google Cloud Storage. But when you take a backup, it goes to zonal disk, and if that zone fails, it's not redundant. It will not go to a different region. If you're on your data is on the East Coast, it does not automatically replicate to the West Coast. In general, for the major hyperscalers out there, you have to configure that, and that does come at a cost, and it does come into more maintenance. With Google Cloud, you can actually just choose a type of disk that allows for that. So it really is a set it and forget it model, and you can replicate by taking backup simply to multi-regional cloud storage. It will replicate across, let's say from East Coast to West Coast without you having to actually click any buttons, set it up, make sure it's working. It just does it through the engineering magic of Google on the back end. So it really does help as you want to plan for redundancy, you want to plan for DR. Just by simply moving backups to that, you can really recover even your non-prods in 24 hours or less, because you have backups that span multiple regions. So it's a lot of great technology that we use when we're deploying SAP on Google Cloud. Next slide. All right, a little bit more about the networking, and really more from a visual standpoint. So I wanted to really focus and show everyone really what the breadth of that networking equates to when it comes to Google Cloud. Everything you see here is connected via Google's own private network. And the reason it's so important to say that is because it allows for things that just aren't available in other clouds. The encryption at rest and in transit, always happening. It's because of this network. Data center HA and DR is because of this network, right? When I have and can try to configure HA in Google Cloud from one region, or sorry, from one zone to another within a region, I don't have to actually worry about anything as it relates to latency. Google has it taken care of because it is their own network. And when I talk about DR or replicating that multi-regional cloud storage, it happens because of this network. So the latency becomes almost a non-issue in Google Cloud because they can commit and own all of their networking. In other clouds, what you oftentimes see happen is latency between regions is definitely something that you have to test out to make sure it works for your application, but even zonal sometimes, right? When you're talking about spinning up HA between different zones within a single region, all that network is generally not private, right? It's not owned by the actual hyperscaler. It's owned by an AT&T or Verizon or something like that. And they all come with different SLAs. So you always have to test out the latency when it comes to that. Here, you do not have to do that. It's set, it's configured, it's engineered this way with specific SLAs across the globe. And it really makes for a very easy deployment model with those additional features that you don't get without extra configuration in other clouds. All right, next slide. And then finally, another big feature of Google Cloud are the other analytics and technologies available outside of just SAP, right? What Managecore tends to focus on is not only deploying SAP environments in Google Cloud, but allowing a foundation, setting up that foundation from the get-go to allow organizations to expand as they see fit, right? So what does that mean? That means that as we deploy SAP, we make sure that foundationally your network and infrastructure is set up so that you can expand. If you want to use BigQuery, if you want to use Cortex, if you want to use any AI or ML going forward, you can do that with the configuration that Managecore is set up. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to limit yourself by moving to the cloud. The whole point of moving to a hyperscaler like Google is to be able to use that technology to better your business, right? You always want to advance your technology, and setting the right foundation is really key and critical to our deployments, and being able to utilize all these different technologies should your company want to is something that Managecore sets out to deliver right out of the gate. Okay, next slide.
Hey, Nick, real quickly, we may just want to add, as we think about these last couple of topics that Nick has talked about in relationship to a RISE deployment, right? So these are all features and functions of Google Cloud that RISE can leverage, right, with SAP sitting on top of it. But if you think of like the network, for example, most of our customers, in addition to being in RISE, have their own, I'll call it native cloud footprint, right? That they have their own workloads they want to put in the cloud in addition to RISE. So think of the scenario where SAP RISE is in Google Cloud. Let's say it's in the Iowa region. If you put all of your other or many of your other workloads in the same region, you have that same, very low latency between SAP and other applications, access to these other Google services. All of that is going to be very quick, very, very fast, and very secure, right? Because again, it's all within the Google networking. So again, not just for the SAP, but as you think about it as a holistically, using Google Cloud for everything, in addition to a RISE platform, all these benefits apply to those systems as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay.
All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about working with RISE and SAP, and really what does that look like, right? And kind of go through a support model and a migration model, so that everyone can get a feel for what is it like to think through a project as you move into RISE using Google Cloud, and then eventually getting that steady state support that Frank had mentioned early on in the presentation. So a little bit about those three pillars, right? From an SAP support standpoint, we want to talk through a lot of the support model as it relates to, what does SAP do? What can you hire CAS to do? What do you need on staff? And a lot of that is taken care of as you go into the RISE model, from a standard keep the lights on type of support from SAP. But then there are tasks that are just required to be done by either the client or by SAP CAS service. And you can really think of it in the fashion of client 000, support from almost if you think of a SaaS-based solution, right? You really get the opportunity to have it running. You get the opportunity to have it patched. You get the opportunity to make sure that there's no issues technically on that platform, but the rest is really up to you. And I'll get to that in a different slide. From a cloud support model, it is tailored toward that SaaS-based solution model, right? So you get generally sold in FTUs, and those models are dependent usually on how many users you have. If you're doing net new deployments, that it'll be kind of cookie cuttered a little bit. There are options to customize it as well, but you generally get a few servers, a dev queue prod. You can request a sandbox, things of that nature. And then application servers, again, fall into, depending on how many users you have. All of that is taken care of by SAP Rise. So they are configuring the servers, they're configuring the environment, the networking to work internally. And then all of, depending on the level of support you choose, they're configuring DR as an example. So HANA system replication, things like that. And really focusing on making sure backups occur, making sure the OS is patched, making sure that it's running as it should on that OS. And all the OS support. So one thing to note with Rise is you don't usually get OS access. So everything OS related, you will interact with SAP to make sure that that support gets done as required. And then the migration support. So the migration is a little different in a Rise. In general, when you migrate into something, some platform like Google Cloud natively, or if you're migrating on-prem, you're building the servers, and on those servers, you're using SWPM or DMO process to migrate those environments. That process is a little different due to the fact that you don't have OS access. So you're generally migrating using a jump server. You're migrating using, interacting with the SAP Rise team to make sure that the files are placed on the server, and just a little bit of a different process. But I'll get a little bit deeper into the migration support here in the next couple slides to really show you what does it mean to migrate into Rise. Next slide. Okay, so what does it mean? Here's an example migration, and again, don't worry about the months. This is just a generic time frame. In general, we see this take about 6 months on average. Some take a little less, some take a little longer, depending on what you're doing. But a lot of that focus at the beginning is spent on project planning. What you will do in a Rise migration is at the beginning, you'll meet with the SAP team, really figure out from a installation perspective, what's my SID going to look like? Or if you have a system you're migrating, what is that SID? What does it need to look like in Rise? You're going to give them all the information around that. You're going to start the networking builds, things of that nature. And you're going to really do that in the first few months. And you'll get it on SAP's radar and build list to build those environments out for you. And then really, you're going to be off to the races, moving your sandbox, your devs, your queues, your prod, and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, you have to take into consideration, what about everything non-Rise, or everything that especially if you're moving systems into Rise, what are all the business functions I've done in my environment that I need to consider when I move to a Rise environment where I may not have OS access, or they're just hosting a subset of servers. In the case of a migration, some of the things that Managecore helps clients navigate are going to be things like, you have SAP today, you're moving your S4 environment in a Rise, but you still clearly need to print. You still need to transfer files. You still need to run certain jobs that may FTP files or something of that nature. When you think about that, moving into a platform where you don't have OS access, it's not a re-engineer, it's just an architect change as you're doing that. So what does that mean? That means that if I'm printing today and I have a print server on one of the SAP environments, let's say ECC prod or S4 prod, and it's running at the OS level there, I want to parse that out, and I want to put that in what we call cloud native, right? So I want to be able to take that environment and have control over it, so that if a print job fails, I don't have to necessarily open a case with SAP to then go look at the OS for me. I want to be able to control an FTP server so that files get dropped in an environment where if the FTP server crashes, I can go at the OS level and look and dig deeper. Those are the few type of things that we take into consideration, along with file shares, right? You want to make sure your file shares are mounted in Rise, but you keep the files generally in cloud native. So we work with you to kind of figure that out, figure out what is critical to your business, but then work with SAP as well to figure out, okay, when we move this, let's get the networking right. What environment or what region or even zone are you putting this in Google Cloud in, so that we can then pair it up and mirror your cloud native solution. So let's say you were in US East and you placed it in Zone A. We would make sure that your environment cloud natively is in the same region, same zone, Zone A. Then we'd pair it together with SAP, make sure that all communicates, and then make sure the networking works between the two environments. And now you can take all your RISE environment, and any network traffic, anything like that, can go right from RISE into Google Native, which is sitting in the same data center. And then from there, you can do things like, one big key area is cybersecurity, right? We're all wanting to really make sure that our systems are secure. We can actually now run all traffic that has to go anywhere else outside of RISE through appliances, next-gen firewalls. We can do all that through the cloud native side of things, and then run it to wherever we need to go. We can make all of that environment talk out to the internet in a safe manner, create DMZs. All of that can be done in cloud native, sitting right next to RISE. And we've done that successfully with a lot of clients to really parse through all the nuances between what you have today and moving to a platform like RISE, and what you still need control over, and what you want to keep control, and what you want to put in a RISE environment. And as Frank mentioned earlier, there could be systems that might not even be candidates to go in RISE. It could be older SAP environments, things of that nature. And we can help migrate those into cloud native as well, and then find that line of delineation. So really that month 1 and 2 is what you're spending that time on. You're analyzing your environment. You're figuring out how are we going to make those connections. What should we parse out? What should we create in a cloud native environment versus what we should create in RISE? And then working with the SAP team to make sure that what goes in RISE, we're filling out the appropriate forms. We're getting it on their schedule to build those systems out so that we can prep for the migrations of the environment. Okay, next slide. So now we've moved into RISE. We've moved into Google Cloud, cloud native, right? So now we have 2 environments, one in RISE and one sitting in cloud native in Google right next to each other. Now, how do we support that, right? Now, if you look at these 3 boxes, the top 3 in orange versus the bottom 3 in blue, they're very similar, but they have slight nuances. So what you get with RISE, you're going to get the Google Cloud resell, right? It's going to all be bundled in. SAP is taking care of all the environment within Google Cloud for the RISE environment. So backups, DR, things of that nature. They're helping with all the OS support. So if you need more disk, if you need more CPU or memory, if you need something specific from the Google Cloud infrastructure, OS patching, they're all taking care of that, and SAP and RISE are taking care of that through your contract. And then in addition to that, they're doing what we call technical basis administration. So items really in client 000, items that are keeping the lights on, it's the kernel patching, it's kicking off database refreshes, it's support packs, things of that nature that require OS access or require the ability to actually change or update the not the configuration, but the coding, if you will, of the SAP product itself. But then if you go to the orange, that's really where Managecore or a customer would come into play. For the cloud native environments, you're working with Google Cloud to then help and provide the additional infrastructure in the cloud native environment. And then when you go to the public cloud, managed services, you or someone like Managecore would then help with the resource provisioning of that environment. They would help and make sure that the network communication between Rise and your cloud native environment are working, and then the backups, the OS patching, all of that within the cloud native environment. And then from a managed services standpoint, really the basis administration, there's still a lot to do. If you've seen the pie chart that Frank mentioned earlier on in the presentation, SAP handles about 40-ish% of the basis tasks that are required on any given day to keep the environment going. But what is additionally put on the client are going to be things like, your productive client. Let's say your client's 300. If you're running out of memory, or if your ABAP code takes and spikes the CPU, if you get a short dump because of your ABAP code or out of memory error because of it, that is on you to make sure it works, right? Print spool administration, user administration, moving transports, all the fundamental basis tasks are still on you to do on a day-to-day basis, right? Those type of things are not necessarily keep the lights on tasks. They're more maintain the environment for the client, and those things are out of scope in general in a standard Rise contract. And so that's where Managecore comes into play as well. If you don't have basis staff, or if you have basis staff today, they would still have to interact with your system. Job scheduling is another one that's big, but they would also have to then interact with SAP and Rise. So if, let's say you wanted to do a refresh, or let's say if you had an issue that you required SAP support for, you have to go in and open a ticket with SAP to troubleshoot and look at. So there is still interaction. You don't get away from not having a basis staff. And it's very critical to understand that nuance. It's not so much a nuance than it is a fact, right? You will need some sort of augmented basis support, whether you hire a firm like Managecore or whether you have an on-staff basis team that can help with that. It is not a complete turnkey solution. Okay, and then a customer use case. So here's a use case with GCP Applied Technologies. So we migrated them about a year and a half, 2 years ago now. One of the first Rise environments in GCP. And it was about a 6-month project. And really all the bullet points I hit on, we ran into with GCP Applied Technologies. So we moved them into Google Cloud. They had a multi-tier landscape, meaning a multi-product landscape, if you will. They had ECC, they had BW, they have a whole slew of other products. One thing to note here is ECC went to Rise while the other environments stayed on Google Cloud Native. So we moved BW to Google Cloud, but then we moved ECC to Rise, and we worked with the Rise team to make that happen. We did the migration into Rise, the transition between it. We set up things like the print servers I mentioned. We set up a NetApp within Google Cloud to actually host a lot of the file shares. In addition to that, we did close down their entire data center. So we moved about 100 SAP workloads, but then about 300 non-SAP workloads. So 400 workloads total, and closed their whole entire data center and moved it to Google Cloud in a matter of about 6 months. So really a great use case for what I've been talking about with really working together with Rise to make sure that support and that migration could happen seamlessly. In addition to that, we do help support them. They don't have a basis staff today, so we help and integrate with their team to handle all the basis functionality, basis support. So we interact with SAP to help when there's issues with Rise or if we have to patch. We interact with them along with our basis staff to help patch the or cloud native SAP environment. So a very large landscape that had a lot of moving parts that we were able to complete in 6 months. And again, those are the type of projects where you run into a lot of nuances, and you're going to have to work through them, right? You're going to have to understand what your environment does and how your environment interacts today so that you can successfully migrate it into Rise and Google Cloud. And that's really where that initial 2 months of planning has come into play so often. Everyone signs a contract and they want to move the first system right away. We do not recommend that, right? We recommend understanding your environment before you move it, because you will run into more problems just by starting to click buttons and move. That foundation is key, and understanding where that line of delineation needs to be. And that's what made this successful, and us be able to do it still in a 6-month time frame. Okay. I think that's it for my end.
Awesome. Sounds good. Frank, I don't know if you want to jump back on, but if anyone has any questions, we can kind of open that up now to the audience.
Yeah, nothing extra except if there are any questions, happy to answer them. If there aren't any questions too, by all means, feel free to reach out to Nick, myself, or Kristen. We're happy to follow up if need be. But I guess with that, does anyone have exact questions or something that we've talked about today that you'd like more information about?
Might be a random question. When we move to Rise, who would own that project? Is it SAP or Managecore? Or or is that a choice that we need to make?
When you say the product, you mean the SAP licenses or which piece?
No, just managing the whole end-to-end implementation.
Yeah, so that's where Managecore can help you with that, right? SAP is obviously because they're going to be hosting it and it's going to be in their data center, they're going to own at a minimum a portion of that project, right? But Deidre, in your case, I think Managecore play probably a larger role just because of our familiarity with it. So we would welcome the opportunity to talk with SAP and come to a joint solution, like what's the best and optimal way to get it migrated. But our preference would be we would love to own that process to get you into Rise.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we can wrap up, Kristen.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for everyone for joining. This is being recorded, so a link will be sent out after. And we really appreciate it. And great job, Frank and Nick.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.